Segment 4, the problem of the 20th century. Now I hit you with a criticism. Stephen Malanga, in a review of The Rational Optimist that he published in the City Journal, and I'm quoting him, consider one glaring omission from The Rational Optimist. The problem of the years 1914 to 1989, 2 world wars that killed some 70 million people, the rise of Hitler, Stalin, Mussolini, and Japanese militarism, the Holocaust and the Cold War. What is the theory of progress that explains why the very people who were prospering from the Industrial Revolution and the rise of democracy plunged themselves into such destructive confrontations? That is a problem.
It's a good question. And it's happened before, and it'll happen again. That is to say, the prosperity produced by trade and commerce will produce regimes that then use that prosperity to wage war either on their own subjects or on somebody else's subjects, etc. It's a common... I regard it as a form of sort of parasitism it's a flea on the back of the thing that's doing good. In other words, human beings have always had 2 ways of prospering. One is to engage in trade, and the other, to grow things and make things and swap them. And the other is to simply steal, to plunder.
Right.
And you can do that either by becoming a king or becoming a thief or some such version, or even a bureaucrat, actually.
Well, so now what I want to do, Matt, is suggest your sequel to this book, because you're pretty careful in The Rationalist Optimist. Actually, you're not careful to avoid the subject. I think it just doesn't interest you per se in this book. And that's politics.
Yeah.
Because I reckon I'm pretty willing to argue, even on only having read the book once, I'm pretty willing to argue that it suggests a classically liberal point of view. Adam Smith was the first rational optimist of whom I'm aware. You're arguing, in effect, I think, I'm putting this to you for your comment, you're arguing, look, if we can have free markets and limited government, we get this cornucopia of activity, of goods and services, of virtues being developed, but we must resist tyrannical government. We must resist a kind of throwback to the old tribal, the Volk of Hitler, or the right. So you this is pretty much, this is an argument for limited government. You're a Tea Party man. You just haven't been told that yet. What do you reckon?
Well, to some extent, yes. I think that there's an old-fashioned human nature in us that wants to stab people in the back and plunder. And we find various ways of keeping that under control. And if you look at the story of the 20th century, do you end up concluding that there was too much government or too little government in the 20th century? And, after a century with Mao and Hitler and Stalin and Pol Pot and Mugabe and Mobutu and et cetera, against that you can set Somalia, too little government. Not even Haiti, though. Haiti had Papa Doc,
Right, much too much.
It's hard to think of examples of countries that had too little government in the 20th century, whereas there are far more examples of countries that had too much. So, yes, I do think that too much government is a much bigger risk than a lot of people in the intelligentsia are prepared to admit.
All right, but another complication here. I just want to see how you respond to this. You've already stated how dramatically life has improved just in your lifetime and mine from the 1950s to the present. But here are other things that have happened, at least in the United States, between the 1950s and the present. The divorce rate has doubled. The rate of illegitimate births has risen from about 5% in 1950 to almost 40% today. So we may be richer in all kinds of ways, but in every way that family life enriches us. You just can't say the illegitimacy rate among blacks and Hispanics is, you just can't say that a child born into a home where he's unlikely ever to get to know his father, or where there are unlikely to be 2 parents until the age of 18, you just can't say that's an improvement over 5 decades ago, can you? So how do you handle that?
Yeah, well,
these social pathologies, there are bits of life that seem to be getting worse, right?
I mean, on the whole, I'm a social liberal as well as an economic liberal.
Right.
You know, I'm somebody. The culture wars of the '60s are about people who don't like the social implications of these economic changes, and people who don't like the economic changes but do like the social changes. I actually like both.
All right. So you don't mind the kind of dissolution of the family.
Let me get to your point, but I mean, so I think it's good that people can get divorced if they're in unhappy marriages. I think it's good that they can come out if they're gay and all these kind of things. But has that led to other problems? Yes, it clearly has. And I think the illegitimacy point is one you raise, although to some extent, you know, if it's two parents who haven't yet got married but are living in a loving relationship, I don't have a problem with illegitimacy per se. But I think the single parent phenomenon is a real issue. And, you know, in the UK we have the same problem, and we look at it, and a big part of it does go back to the way the benefit system rewards single parenthood, and that has to be tackled. You know, we can't bury our heads in the sand, and we have to say we're giving perverse incentives here. We're giving people incentives to bring up kids in non-optimal ways, and we would like to give people incentives to try and stay together and make a two-parent household because that would work better. So I'm all for tinkering with the incentives to try and solve those problems, but I don't think that means we have to go back to an intolerant conservative view of the family, for example.